Good morning. I'm going to present another book on astrology today, this time one in English. Now this book was published in 1811, and this was a time in the history of astrology when astrology was just undergoing a revival. There had been a very, very quiet period during the 18th century with virtually no new books published until the 1780s. At that point, there was the four-part work of Ebenezer Sibley on the celestial science of astrology, which then ran through several editions and was still popular by 1811. So we could say that there had been a considerable revival of interest in England in astrology already at this time, but this was one of the first new works since then to appear. And it's by a character called Thomas White. Now I'll just put the book up to the camera so you can have a look at it for a moment. You see this is a spine which just says White's Astrology, but and you can see this book has very plain boards with a leather spine. If you look inside you can see the title page. It's very, very difficult to actually get this displayed properly on camera, but there you can just about see. I'm going to read out the full title. The Beauties of Occult Science Investigated, or The Celestial Intelligencer, in two parts. Part the first containing a plain, easy and comprehensive introduction to astrology, with all the requisites for obtaining a familiar and general knowledge of the science. A new table of ascensional differences for 30 degrees of declination to the poles of the houses for the British metropolis, and many other particulars never before published. Part the second containing the method of calculating, directing and judging nativities, both according to the Argolian system and the doctrine of Ptolemy, the whole illustrated by the nativities of several eminent personages, such as Louis the 16th, late King of France, Napoleon Bonaparte, and several others never before made public, by Thomas White, printed and published by Anne Davis in London in 1811. There's also a detailed table of contents after this, which basically shows that this follows a fairly standard pattern for works of the time of covering the elementary aspects of astrology, such as the houses, diseases under which various different planets are traditionally believed to have rulership, and such things as aphorisms for guiding judgment on marriage, general effects produced by the position of the lords of the houses and by the planets in each of the 12 signs, and by the aspects, as well as the signification of directions, and brief comments on transits and revolutions. There are then also sections on particular human concerns for judgment, such as riches, honour and dignity, the quality of the profession, marriage, children, travelling, the quality of death. And there are also brief sections on the signification of fixed stars and secondary directions, before there are various nativities delineated at the end, about 50 pages worth. I also think it's worth reading out a little bit from the introduction, which gives a fuller idea of White's view on astrology. He says the following: according to the concurrent doctrine of ancient and eminent philosophers, it appears a life is infused throughout all things, an intellectual and artificial fire, an inward principle, animal spirit, or natural life, producing and forming within, as art doth without, regulating, moderating, and reconciling the various motions and qualities of this mundane system. By virtue of this life, the great masses are held together in their orderly courses, as well as the minutest particles governed in their natural motions, according to the several laws of attraction or gravity, with which every particle of matter is endowed. Hence it may be supposed, agreeably to the configuration and respective temperament of the heavenly bodies, together with the various configurations or aspects and influences the one upon the other, and of course upon the individual that is born, for in proportion as these respectively operate together, will be the bent and inclination of the person who is born under such and such position of the celestial stars. If their aspects or positions are favourable, and benevolent planets are above the horizon, much good will certainly ensue to the native. If evil configurations, and the benevolent planets are under the earth and evilly posited, much anxiety and sorrow will inevitably ensue. This long experience daily manifests to the lovers of this science, and that the native will be able, by the apparent strength of the stars at his birth, to achieve the most stupendous actions. On the contrary, if the positions of the principal planets are weak, he will naturally be unfortunate, supine, and quite inactive. This is most wonderfully and clearly perceived in all men's nativities, as well as their inclinations to vicious or virtuous pursuits. By directions, the time of marriage, fortune, death, etc., is most accurately known, and if the arithmetic is right, there is a great certainty in it. Astrology, then, I consider as the effects derived from the amazing powers of mutual attraction of the different parts and masses, great or small, of matter, the one upon the other, which knowledge is to be attained by study and observation of the influences produced by the motions of the heavenly bodies. For as astronomy hath its origin in the motion and revolution of the stars, so astrology is founded on the effects and influences of attraction and gravitation in the same bodies, observed from the nativities of different persons. And should any deny the situation of the stars, as they are set down by our skilful astronomers, he must be sent to their most accurate astronomical tables, founded on the best mathematical principles. So he who denies the influences of astrology must be referred for conviction to the predictions verified in the genitors of different persons, and observe how beautifully the actions and accidents of various persons agree with the horoscope and correspond with the astrologer's predictions. Human nature is subject to error, so that no science can be deemed absolutely perfect. Only according to the course of nature, God permitting, such accidents will befall the native at such time, saith the artist. Astrology cannot be repugnant to the Christian religion, unless it be a sin to study nature or astronomy. On the contrary, it has a tendency to elevate the mind to the contemplation of God the Father of all. It may be, as our treatise mentions, attended with real service to lead every individual to know future events, forewarned, forearmed. For a person to know the leading features or dispositions in his nature by means of the configuration of the stars in the hour of birth, especially if those features or aspects predict an evil tendency, must be of the greatest consequence to the individual concerned, namely that he may thereby, when he has arrived to years of maturity, and let us hope of discretion also, make use of his reason and better judgment, as a corrector of the natural proneness to vice, which he sees predominant in his constitution. White then goes on in his introduction to discuss a little about the history of astrology, which he studied in some detail, as well as different famous people such as Dryden, who have had an interest in astrology. And he concludes, "Now finding that astrology in all ages has been much professed and encouraged by many eminent and exalted characters, surely then no person has the least reason to deem this study beneath their most profound attention, but on the contrary, they will find it deserving their leisure and regard, for so simple and easy is the knowledge of astrology, that only by making it the amusement of a few hours, or by attentively pursuing this work, will soon find it become familiar to them, and the more they dive into it, the more beauties they will continually discover." Finally, a little bit about White, biographically speaking. He had rather a sad fate. There was a magazine published 30 years later by Richard Morrison, the first Zadkiel, called The Horoscope, which was a monthly magazine. In fact, he had a weekly magazine of the same name back in the 1830s, but that only ran for 19 weeks. Then he relaunched it in 1841 as a monthly, and it ran for a further 6 issues. At a certain point in this magazine, we find correspondence which meticulously describes the fate of Thomas White. I'm going to read out the letter because it's very, very interesting. I'll just hold up the volume to the camera. This is the somewhat worn copy of The Horoscope from 1841. We have an article, The Laws Against Astrology. A letter from somebody to the editor of The Horoscope. Sir, I was very much pleased to find in a former number of The Horoscope that you had taken notice of the penal laws relating to astrology, laws which are a disgrace to any civilized nation. Many of your readers may not perhaps be acquainted with the fate of Mr. White, author of a work on astrology called The Celestial Intelligencer. And how will your readers feel when they hear that this Mr. White died a martyr in the cause of this science? Some years since, Mr. White came to reside in the Isle of Wight, and during his stay there, a friend of mine, who was also a friend of Mr. White's, advised him to be very circumspect during that year in giving judgment on figures, as he foresaw from his revolution that he would be in danger of imprisonment. White promised him that he would be circumspect. He was, however, taken quite off his guard in the following manner. 2 men entered his apartments, when one of them informed him that he had lost his watch, and should feel obliged to him if he would give him some information respecting it, to which Mr. White answered him that he could have nothing to say in it. However, by a continued persuasion, he drew out a figure, and simply told him that he did not think that the watch was lost, but merely mislaid, but that if it were lost, such a description of person had it at the present time. That will do, replied one of the men, and threw half a crown on the table, when White replied, I do not want the money, nor do I make any charge for what I have done. However, in the course of a few minutes, in walked a peace officer, and took White into custody. And what, sir, should you suppose was the result? Nothing less than that he was sent to Winchester jail for 12 months, and that at the expiration of that he was to be placed in the pillory. The poor man's feelings could not bear with this disgraceful sentence. He therefore died of a broken heart, after suffering, I believe, about 3 months' confinement in prison. Now, sir, could you scarcely believe that these 2 men were sent on purpose to entrap Mr. White by a magistrate in the Isle of Wight? The only remark I shall make on the foregoing is this, that it is high time that such a disgraceful and an abominable law was repealed, which placed it in the power of any one to treat an intellectual and well-informed man worse than a humane man would treat a brute. I am, sir, yours respectfully, a lover of science. P.S. This affair occurred in 1813. Of course it was illegal, and the magistrate and his myrmidons ought to have been indicted for conspiracy. So there we have it, the sad fate of Thomas White, just 2 years after the publication of his main work on astrology of over 400 pages. Of course, things have got somewhat easier in the West for astrologers since that time, but it wasn't the last brush a major astrologer had with the law. Thank you for listening. That was all I had to talk about today. Bye-bye.